So without further ado, let me introduce Greg King with today's virtual clinic presented by EUPA. So Greg, maybe if you want to start off talking a little bit about yourself.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I have a slide that I'll kind of introduce myself a little bit to here. So I'll just pull up my presentation and kind of get going on it and do that while I'm in there. So let's see. Share. Got that. Okay. And just need to move this up.
And also don't forget, anytime if folks have questions, feel free to type them into the chat, and then Greg will get a chance to address those throughout the presentation.
So welcome everyone. I was asked to do this by Vicky and EUPA as an opportunity. We were just talking with someone before this that some cohorts have now started. People have been able to play Frisbee now, but at this point, I haven't personally, so it's just been a lot of thinking about Frisbee. And this gave a good opportunity just to kind of get some stuff down on paper and think about it. Last clinic, Jen Beck went through cutting and a little bit of offensive strategy. And so today I took on looking at defensive strategy and kind of, I entitled it Expanding Your Defensive Toolbox. So pick and choose and think about which things you want to integrate, and we can talk a little bit more about that later. So, do an introduction, talk about some individual defensive skills that I think are really important and can kind of quickly raise your game, and then talk about a couple of team strategies. I know that right now we're in cohorts, and so like the teams, I guess, are pretty static. So these could be cool opportunities where you're playing with a new group of people to try something new maybe that you wouldn't on a normal league team or anything like that. So about me, so I've been playing Ultimate since about 2004. I started in university in Ontario, and I've had an opportunity to play in Switzerland, New Brunswick, and now I'm living in Alberta. I live in Camrose, working at Augustana, part of the University of Alberta. And beyond playing, I've had lots of opportunity to play in different places. And I'm going to talk about that, how that's contributed a little bit to my thinking on Frisbee, but also coaching. Started as more of a captain of teams, and then took advantage of some of the certification programs that Ultimate Canada was offering to train and then certify. And I had an opportunity to coach the Queen's University women's team a couple of years when I was living in Kingston, which was an amazing opportunity. And also last year, I had an opportunity to coach throwback here in Edmonton all the way to nationals. So that was really fun as well. And I kind of wanted to ask just a little bit, maybe can you do this quickly, Vicky, and like unmute? There's only like 4 of us, so we could just kind of say and who's watching and maybe kind of what you're playing right now at what level.
Let's see. Yeah, we're like, what's our league doing, or what am I doing?
What are you doing? Like your name and like kind of like, yeah, I think.
Yeah, I'm Ryan Slater. I play at pretty mid-level. I played a little bit on Bunny Thug's like B team a year ago.
Yep.
And yeah, generally try to get to as many tournaments as I can. I've been kind of bouncing between competitive side of things and the spirit side of things.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's like, I think that like playing in lots of tournaments, I think that's something that's going to come up again. So that's good. Yeah. And who else is here? I know Al's here.
Here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
I'm also not back at playing yet. I don't know how that's going to work or what that's going to look like or where I'm going to be playing when I do return. But for now, I'm just here as a Frisbee nerd who loves defense.
Nice. Anyone else want to pitch in there? I don't know. Like when I designed this, it was really aimed at kind of somebody who's been playing league for a bunch, maybe has some exposure to starting competitive Frisbee and thinking about that, but as an opportunity to really think about how you play defense and different strategies that maybe don't get introduced or don't get talked about a lot. So that's kind of where I'm going from there. So if that's good, then we'll just kind of move on and kind of talk about a general introduction to what my personal theory is on the role of defense. As Jen pointed out in the last webinar on cutting, that offense generally speaking has an advantage in that they know kind of where they want to go. They know where they're trying to throw the disc. And so as a defender and as a team defense, we need to think about reducing that advantage. I don't think we can get eliminated completely, but we can all think about how do we push the offense into making specific decisions and choices that make it more difficult for them to reach their goals, which would be generally the end zone, and kind of contribute towards that. And I think that can take the form of both individual adjustments and also team strategies. And I'll talk a little bit about both. And for me anyway, I know that the D-line, you try to score, but I don't think scoring is necessarily defensive main motivation. It's really to make it as difficult as possible for the offense and generate as many turnovers as possible. And I say that because it's a little bit unrealistic to put your D-line on and say, okay, your job is to score 3 points this game. Your job is to generate as many turnovers as possible. And especially if you can generate them close to the offense's end zone, then you can try to put one of those in. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about individual skills and especially some quick kind of things that you can do as a player to kind of bring your level up and think about bringing to any scheme or team that you bring on. So these are really individual based. And the first one is the mark. I think that this is the key part of a defensive approach to Frisbee is the mark. You're responsible for really kind of implementing your team strategy, be the first point where you can channel or focus the offense to throw discs in certain places and prevent them from throwing in other places. So this is where it can be and kind of came up with a couple of things, quick ways to improve your mark. And for me, the first thing is just bringing energy on your mark. That a lot of people, were chasing a cutter around the field. They may beat us in, they get the disc, and it's like, oh, cool, I get a chance. I don't have to run anymore. I can kind of just take a breath here. And if you view it as taking a rest, you're kind of putting it at a disadvantage. You're giving that advantage back over to the offense, right? That you're going to react to what they're doing rather than defining what you want them to do. So putting in a little bit more energy, not viewing it as a rest. Like, don't be one of those people. Stay in a movement ready stance. Be dynamic. Keep your weight on the balls of your feet. Get your hips low. Get your arms kind of using your arms. And there's different approaches to this. Some people like to kind of have their arms really wide all the time. Others prefer just to kind of have your arm kind of in and being kind of flashing out back and forth. But in any way, just being dynamic on a mark really makes it harder for a thrower. And I would say that the last point there is don't be afraid to be unpredictable on a mark. So yes, we have a team strategy. We're forcing home. We don't want the disc to break to the away side of the field. But, if you feel that you can make kind of a movement to shut down a throw that you see, be unpredictable. Move your distance from the mark. For example, a lot of people, when we start playing, we kind of plant ourselves a certain distance, disc space, and then maybe a little bit more. But we forget that we can mark from up to 3 meters or 10 feet, right? So varying that distance you are from the thrower can have a huge impact on what they see on the field and the angles and throws that they have. So that's something you can do is to create a little dynamic in your mark. The other thing is to be mentally engaged. So the biggest thing is obviously as a team knowing the force. That's important. I think everybody, probably especially in this room, has probably heard, what's the force? You're not keeping the force, right? So that's the basic, is to know what the force is. But then beyond that, and especially as you go to the next level, is what is your team defensive priority? Is it really no breaks? Is it just flat breaks? Is it really no inside breaks? As a team, when you decide upon what are the dangerous parts of the field, that should really be your focus as a mark, and really kind of saying, okay, I really don't want a disc to go here, but I'm okay with a disc, losing yards or going sideways, because that still retains our theory of defense or what we're trying to do. Thinking about what's the most dangerous threat on the field. So as you approach a mark, where's the continuation? Is this person a great handler or a weak thrower? Do they like to huck, or have they been breaking the mark all game and maybe you've matched up on them, and you can make those kind of little adjustments that generally we tend to mark up on similar people over either the course of a game or a course of a season. And we might get to know what some of their tendencies are, that those are good things to keep in mind and being mentally engaged there. Thinking about where you are on the field is also really important. I would definitely be putting on a different type of mark, say closer to the sideline than the middle of the field, perhaps even a different type of mark closer to the opponent's end zone than my own end zone. So thinking about where you are on the field can get you kind of thinking a little bit more about that mark. And again, what throws do they like? So if you have someone, I mean, we all know somebody, I've played for long enough that just, they love their hammer. It's like, okay, well, you know, I'm gonna put my right hand up because I'm guessing that there's a hammer coming here. Or, you know, they really like their backhand, but not so much their forehand. So, you know, I'm going to sit a little bit more. I know that our force as a team is something, but my knowledge about this player, I'm going to use that to improve my mark. One specific type of marking strategy that I've been learned about kind of thing and taught to a number of teams, and this is not my own, obviously, none of this information is just kind of, this is how Frisbee works. I think we learn from other people and from other resources, and we're kind of changing it and putting it into our own words. One of those is the triangle mark. And so I'll show you a animation of that in a second. But basically as a triangle mark, it infers this dynamic mark where, you know, a thrower might have the disc centered or out in their flick grip or forehand grip. And as a mark, you want to react to that a little bit. And so this triangle mark system is talking about, okay, stop the throw that they're showing so that they can't quickly get a throw off. And as a mark, or as a thrower, basically, generally, if I have to pivot, it means I can't necessarily, you can't throw at the same time you're pivoting, more or less. You can do it at the end of a pivot, but if you can get a mark or a thrower to pivot, then that means that that you're winning that kind of defensive matchup. So as they pivot, you really want to shuffle to take away that pivot. The important part with this third part of the triangle mark is that you don't want to shuffle back and forth on the same pathway as your thrower. Because basically with that initiation that they have and the ability to dictate when they're going to pivot, you'll eventually be a step behind if you follow them exactly. Whereas if you shuffle to take away the first pivot and then you drop and then shuffle to take away the second pivot, you take an angle. And so what this looks like is a triangle. And so I'm going to have a number of different animations and fields here. And so this is just kind of a legend, so you can get a sense that the direction of play is our yellow arrow, direction of the force is our purple arrow, the little blue ones, defensive player, white X's are offensive player, and the yellow is the disc. So just keep that in mind going forward. And so this is an example of the triangle mark where we're forcing to the bottom of the screen. I'm going to assume everyone's right-handed in my diagrams. I'm sorry, left-handed folks. But basically this would be kind of a forehand flick grip that this offensive player is holding it in. And we have our mark. And if a pivot happens, we want to come across to block that pivot, because really we are forcing to the bottom of the screen. We really don't want throws out towards the top. What happens though is that if we went back flat again, we would be a little bit behind. And so instead of going straight flat across on this next pivot, what we do is we drop off a little bit and then come back in towards. And so in that way, you take away a dangerous angle of the disc to get the kind of an inside throw there, and then reestablish what your initial position is. And so it gives you the ability to stay a little bit more on top of a thrower and their throwing options than you would if you kind of. So thinking, and again, this comes back to varying your distance from the thrower and thinking about those angles. What about before the mark though? So before the mark, so we can bring energy in the mark, we can think about where we are on the field, but what about before the mark? How do we make those decisions and set ourselves up in a good position to contain things? And so the biggest thing is stopping continuation. I like to call this the corral. But basically if we are set up here and our disc is yellow, and say we're the defender in the middle of the field, we're in a good position, but a break comes out, disc goes to the break side. a lot of newer players and players even who've been playing for a long time would be like, okay, well, I have to get to my player as fast as possible and really put this mark on. So they run directly at them. But if we think about the force and where we're trying to push this disc, we're trying to push it to the bottom of the screen. And so by running directly at them, although it's the fastest pathway, we're giving that option for the thrower to continue the disc up the break side, and we lose that ability to contain. So instead, what I would say is a much better strategy is to kind of run outwards to corral and stop that break and then come back in. And then you can set your mark. And I wasn't able to figure out animations to flip everybody. Imagine that this is a proper mark. And so that simple movement of moving outwards, again, is containing angles and bringing it back in so that we can reestablish as a defense and dictate where we want the offense to move and throw on the field and look on the field. The next part of that, so this is kind of for a break situation, but you can also use this example of stopping continuation, cutter who's coming in and catching the disc. And in that sense, I say it's like shoulder check. So, and you can, I think this should be something that a lot of players implement into their games. So say that you're downfield, a cutter's made a great cut, so you're a little bit behind them, trailing as they come in. They receive the disc. You're going to come to them directly, basically here, because you don't need to necessarily corral anything. But as you're moving in, if you take a little bit of a look behind you, we should see, oh, there we go. Little red arrow. That little red arrow is kind of just like a shoulder check. Just, you don't have to stop and stare behind you. It's amazing how quickly your brain will process where somebody is. You can see the next player that maybe is the most important threat to contain. And so instead of running directly at your mark to stop that, you might shift your pathway just a little bit, right? Shift your pathway, prevent that throw from coming up, or at least make it difficult, right? Even if they throw that, you have a chance to get in the way. And if you don't get in the way and you don't block it, maybe it makes the throw difficult. It goes lofty, it's windy, and your defenders downfield give you a better shot. And this is a little bit what I mean about energy on the mark. The more energy we put in on the mark, I find that the more likely you are. You might not generate a hand block or a foot block or all those kind of amazing things that you want to do, but you help your team create throwing situations that are more likely to be D'd, because you kind of change throwing angles, you make people do things they really don't want to do, right? So it's these little things. What about downfield defense though? So that's on the mark, thinking about throwers. Downfield defense, what I really like to establish with teams is thinking about quadrants, breaking the field into quadrants. And you can do this wherever the disc is. I've set up the disc here in the middle of the field, and thinking about breaking into 4 zones. So number 1 is our force side under. So here we're marking, I didn't left out my purple arrow. Here we're marking to the right-hand side of the screen. Is that right? Right-hand side of the screen? Yes, okay, good. No. That we're looking there. So this is a force side under is number 1. Number 2 would be your break side under. So you don't want to break them up, but that's kind of shorter throw. Number 3 would be your force side deep. And number 4 would be your break side deep. So you can think about the field in this way and break it up. And each of these is kind of more or less likely to happen really on any given throw. And as a defender downfield, if you're trying to stop everything, you're basically not going to be stopping anything. And in that sense, what it means is kind of, Jen talked about kind of getting your defender to overcommit. And as a defender, you don't want to aggressively attack something that is really less likely to come out because of a mark or just where on the field that throw might come from. Because then you're going to get beat to a spot where it's much more likely to have a successful completion, retain possession, and keep moving. And so what I would say is that this order is kind of the way that I think about it. We could quibble about 2 and 3, but number 1 is really where it's the easiest to make catches. It's a short throw. It's on the force side. So if you get beat into that area, it's going to be really easy to retain possession. Number 2 is probably also easy, but you have the mark there on the break side. Number 3 and 4, number 3 especially is a deep throw. Generally on deep throws, you have a little bit more time to catch up and make a play. And if you're on the force side, it's a little bit easier than on the break side. So 4 break side deep is really, in kind of this example, would have to be a long around OI backhand maybe, or a hammer or something overhead, right? And so what I like to say as a defender to defenders is to think about these zones and think about where you want to be positioned, and that you don't always have to be as tight to your offensive player, your check, your mark, depending on which zone they happen to be in. So zone 1 for me is extremely tight defense. This is where we are trying to really prevent anything in a general situation from any. So you really don't want to beat underneath. And so you're going to play tight defense here and be really aware. Number 2 is something that I say to a zone is like a touch defense. So you don't need to be playing aggressively to the break side, especially as a team. We have a great mark. They're committed to taking away that field. Throws to that side would not be as direct, would hopefully be a little bit loopy. And so if you're within kind of an arm's reach, or you can kind of touch your individual marking, then you have an opportunity to make a D. Similarly, for 3, if our focus is on preventing no unders, then 3 would also be touch defense, where if they're going deep, you want to respect that, but you can also give them a little bit more space because you have a little bit more time if a deep throw comes up. It has to be a little bit loftier usually, and it gives you time to kind of catch up. And you can also have people kind of maybe helping out. And that gets to number 4, which is this concept of help defense. 4 is the least, I would say, dangerous of these quadrants. And so you really want to use that opportunity to have an opportunity to look for an opportunity to help someone else. So use this opportunity. We're usually maybe very focused on our player and our cutter. And so you can actually look away from your cutter at this point really quickly, get a sense of where the disc is, get a sense of if anyone else is in a bad situation, you could help them out. When your offensive player is in that quadrant, this is kind of what I would say is this is an opportunity for help defense. Of course, you can't necessarily leave if then they're coming back in towards 1 or 2, you still need to reestablish that position afterwards. Oh, Vicky's in, someone's in the waiting room, Vicky. I don't know if you can see that.
I thought I had admitted them.
I don't know. Ryan Lacey jumped up. It came up on my screen. Sorry.
Oh.
So improving your individual defense, Jen kind of came up with a bunch of points about how to work on your individual cutting. And I would generally agree that a lot of those overlap with how to work on your individual defense. So challenging yourself at league practice, either challenge yourself by usually matching up against someone who's quote unquote better than you. Of course, everyone's trying to match up with someone who's better than you, but maybe it's a specific skill set, you know, Bill has really great around backhands. I'm going to try to stop those around backhands and really adjust my mark in this practice to really commit to that one idea. At league of practice, instead of throwing, using your warm-up time, kind of just generally tossing with people, it's important to warm up, but working on your footwork. I agree with Jen. I think that's a really easy way for people to kind of think about, okay, how do I change my hip position? I didn't even talk about that really, but using your footwork as a defender is really key, especially when you think dynamic marks. You need to be able to shuffle quickly back and forth, move in and out. Those are all footwork-based things you can work on. So on your own, I really, I guess I would be more of a cerebral player kind of thing, that I think about what I did and I come off the field and I talk to my players who were on the same time. It's like, what was going on at that point? What did we do so wrong? Like, how did they work it up the field so quickly? What could we have done better? Other players maybe are just playing by feel and they don't really know. So you have to work this out with your teammates about who wants to talk about the point afterwards. Not everyone does. But thinking through those previous points, how it progressed and the decisions you made and any adjustments you can make can really help that. Just kind of a quick, kind of 30 seconds. Okay, cool. What happened there? What could I change? And then you're back into being on the sideline to help everyone else. And then on your own, it's also really nice to watch. If you're not on the field, watching and picking somebody on the sideline, we tend to follow the disc always with our eyes, but watching a defender and kind of saying, okay, how would I approach this if I was in their position? Oh, I see this cut. What are they doing? Okay, I would have done that instead, right? Like kind of internal monologue to think about. So at this point, that's like kind of the end of my spiel on individual skills. So we can unmute, and if there's any questions about that kind of stuff, I'd be happy to have a discussion. I also have a movement. Everyone can stand up and kind of do that if they want. But if there's any questions, happy to answer them.
Yep.
And then we're getting into team strategies next, so that's coming.
Yep. So feel free to kind of type your questions into the chat, and then I can read them out. Or since there's not so many people, you can also unmute yourself and ask the question. One thing I did want to comment is that idea of the triangle mark. I know at the very beginning, you know, when you're a newer player, someone just says, just stand on just stick with the force, just be there and stand still and don't move. But then a lot of those newer players will see a little bit more experienced players moving around a lot, but still not letting the disc come through. And it's really nice to kind of visually understand what that means, like where those trajectories are. And I remember, like, with throwback, we had worked on this in a practice, and it was just really great to be able to see it in a diagram and go, oh, this is what it's for. So that's really great. So I'm glad that you covered that aspect there.
And I think even as we introduce, like, kind of to new players, we often say, okay, stand at 45 degrees, you know, you're just kind of doing this. And people take that as static kind of things. And I think the way we teach marking, we can talk a little bit more about dynamic marks. I think the triangle mark is probably a step up from that, but like even just the ability to shuffle your feet a little bit, you know, and move side to side is a good thing.
And I think too, introducing that idea that being closer isn't always better when you're trying to cover, you know, you have to find that sweet spot of not being so far away that you're letting a lot through, but then not being so close that you just have nowhere to move.
Yeah. I mean, as a thrower, I like it when marks are much closer, because then I can move them and throw underneath. Whereas as soon as you take a step back, if anyone's done like the 3-person drill where you have a receiver who's basically the same line as you, you're throwing and you have a mark, as soon as the mark backs off, you know, 5-6 feet, it becomes very hard to actually move them because they're taking away those angles. Obviously on a field, there's different angles and things like that you have to consider, but it can add something to your mark.
So Al's got a question. Go ahead, Al.
Is, and this may be covered more in the team section, but if I'm playing defense and my mark is way faster than me, what are some tips you have for how I should adjust my marking or how I should adjust my defense away from the mark?
Okay, so like you're covering somebody who's way faster than you mean?
Yeah. That's right.
Is that okay? I think that can come back to a situation where you want to think about where you're pushing an offensive team to go. So, for example, you want them to throw to kind of the break side, or you want to force home. That if they're faster than you, you really don't want to overcommit to going to one area. And I think that quadrant sense where it's like, okay, these are the important areas where I really need to kind of I need to not give them this. And if they're faster than me, then I don't want to overcommit to going to another area and have them beat me back in. So spacing, I think, is a big thing. And in terms of like, I think I do a lot of handler defense and thinking about that. And I know you're going to talk about bailing in the next thing, but if people are looking to throw and go, you know, a quick throw and go up line, get a continuation, as somebody who's marking somebody, if they're faster than me, I just want to take another step off. I want to be a little bit further away than I would be on somebody I think that I match speeds with, because it gives me a little bit more time to react, is what I would say, is that you can anticipate a little bit more and kind of have that spacing that's available to you. Oh, Vicky, someone else is on the waiting room, I guess.
Oh, I think I've let them in already.
Okay, good. Yeah.
So for those just joining, we're just doing some questions. So if you just joined us, feel free to kind of raise your hand or make a note. Do you have any kind of comments on, I know this always happens a lot of times in league, especially with newer players coming from other sports. So that idea of playing defensively without getting into situations of dangerous play, what would be your advice to kind of like mention to players coming from other sports? That's, you know, that would be the kind of guidelines to follow to ensure that we don't end up with a dangerous play situation.
I mean, I think Jen really covered this really well in her her webinar kind of a couple of weeks ago. It's just kind of being spatially aware on the field where other people are, and kind of, I don't know, I'm aiming this at a kind of a league player audience, is that it's not worth going through somebody to make a D. Is that kind of idea where it's like, you know, there's a certain amount of contact you might have at higher levels, but you know, in a league game, it's not worth doing that. And so when you think about coming from another sport, though, it's I would say it's dependent on your team and and to ask questions like, what is okay here, and to talk about that even with your opponent. That's the thing I really like about Spirit of the Game, is that you can have these conversations and talk about them and be like, oh, okay, cool. I didn't know that was a foul or something like that. In terms of the quadrant defense, it's kind of like, you know, you can be in someone's pathway, but you can't jump into someone's pathway. So if someone's running by you, you can't kind of jump into the pathway that they're taking. That would be a foul. And so you have to establish your space as a defender, and kind of keep that.
Great. Any other questions from folks in the audience?
I can just move on to, as people think about it, you know, I'll move on to team strategies and talk a little bit about that and then go from there.
Great. Perfect.
Okay, so this is a little bit more about kind of overall strategies for your team, and thinking about it as a concept of team defense. A lot of the individual skills, they apply regardless of the system that you're playing. But team defense is very different, because in a team defense, you're kind of committing to a common goal and you're working as a unit rather than a group of individual players all kind of doing their own thing. You know, everyone's committed. And a good team defense really limits those options for the offense, and you're less reactive. You're really kind of dictating, okay, we're okay with the offense moving the disc in this type of way or to these spaces on the field. And so the goal of this little section here is just to introduce some potential options that you could use. So what are we giving them? What are we taking away? What kind of things, you know, are we a containment defense, or are we a high risk, high reward? We might put a lot of pressure on to try to generate that turnover, but we're leaving ourselves open for opportunities. And these are just potential options. So there's a bunch of them, and I'll introduce them, but I don't think they're all going to apply to all teams, right? You shouldn't take all of these things and try to apply all of them next week. But, you know, pick one and kind of say, oh, can we do this? Can we improve this? Can we add this to our toolbox, right? And the reason that I like this is that you can counteract an offense with just a different defensive look, but you can also provide an unpredictable look. If the whole game your team has been forcing flick or forcing forehand, and then suddenly you force backhand for a point, oftentimes it will generate a turnover simply because it's like, what's going on? Why are they standing on the other side? What's this throw that I suddenly have available that wasn't available before? And so by having a toolbox of different defenses, you're not going to use all of them in any given game, but it gives you the ability to throw a look out, and kind of say, okay, everyone's on the same page. We understand this. We can try this just for a point. And, you know, if it's successful, maybe we'll bring it back, or we'll bring it back later in the game. And this is another point, getting back to where you have an opportunity to play in a lot of tournaments. You play with different groups of people. Different teams have different opportunities and perspectives and thinks on ways they would play defense. And so by doing that, you're exposing yourself to more knowledge, and you can bring that back to your league teams or otherwise. And it's a really great way to just to play with other people, and play in different places. You know, I know the Prairies is a pretty big place, so it's hard to get out of here sometimes, but If you go to another province and you go to another country to play, even, like, you'll come across some very different perspectives on Frisbee than you would otherwise. And this is kind of my guiding thought here. It's very tempting, if the only tool you have is a hammer, to treat everything as if it were a nail. And as a league team, I would say that force forehand or force flick, is like where we get introduced. Everyone, it's the harder throw to learn. So for beginners, that's kind of what happens. We force forehand and then we never give it up. And so everything is just like, well, we just got to force flick. Just play harder, force flick more. And so as you build that toolbox, though, then we can kind of expand on that and maybe try something a little bit different. So the standard would be, your force forehand. And so the purple arrow here is kind of showing where you're forcing. I've set it up so that you kind of see where generally defenders would play, assuming kind of mostly taking away the unders. And so you're forcing towards the right-hand side of the screen. And really that shaded box is kind of saying, we want to dictate to the offense that they can have throws, to this side of the field, but we don't want them to go the other way because then we'll be caught off balance and you can run. What about changing the force? Just simply changing the way that you force backhand can kind of introduce all sorts of interesting changes to a defense and to an offense who's playing against it. That you're just kind of flipping everything and you're forcing the other direction. A lot of times when you might use this, I don't know in Edmonton necessarily. I played a little bit of the indoor, but we play a different style in Edmonton. But when you take away the wind and you're playing indoors, people's throws get great. And so, there's a lot more overhead throws. And so the tendency in indoor has always been, for me, is to play more backhand, because a backhand mark takes away kind of the hammers for right-hand players, which is the most of the players kind of thing. And so it makes it harder to throw those overhead throws. But in terms of outdoor play, I think this forcing backhand, forcing forehand really comes into play when you're thinking about wind or sun direction or things like this, where it's like, okay, well, we want to force them, into the wind or against the wind, depending on your team strategy. And being able to kind of know how you position yourself and how you would respond to different movements using these different forces is helpful. So one thing to note is that oftentimes your flick is a faster throw to get off. And so when you're forcing backhand, you're giving that flick throw, that forehand throw would be a break. And so you have to be a little bit more diligent on not preventing that break, because it is very fast. You don't have to pivot necessarily to get to that break side. And so that forced backhand really has to be committed on that mark to not giving up those breaks. So maybe you're, fishing a little bit less and you're really pushing into that backhand space. One that I kind of was first exposed to when I moved to Switzerland is kind of combining both of them. Let's force middle. So let's not force to a sideline, but rather let's force back to the middle of the field. And this can be really effective if teams are using a vertical stack, because you're basically using that stack as an extra defender or choking up the middle of the field. And so how it works is that if you have the disc on one sideline, so for example, here we have it on the left side of the field, you're basically splitting the field into more or less two sides. And here we're forcing back towards the middle of the field. If the disc, and we're defending this side with the quadrant, if the disc moves, say we get beat kind of to the other side of the field, and now we're over here, that we would actually shift our marks to the other side. Now, in this example, it's hard to move necessarily all the pieces around, but depending on where our cutters are, we might actually shift the side that we're on as downfield cutters. So this force middle kind of gets at the concept of team defense, and a key component of that is communication. So almost as the disc is in the air, as a defender who's coming in to mark the thrower, you need to decide which direction I'm going to mark and communicate that really loudly to everybody in your team, get people to echo it. In general, Frisbee players are very quiet compared to other sports, and we don't communicate that much on the field. And so bringing that communication level up can be a key component. And so here we'd be forcing back to the left-hand side. And again, what might happen, again, this zone is moving, but that zone is always including that central part of the field there, where if a huck goes up or something, you want to kind of throw through that stack, the chances of tipped or picked off, or kind of things like that are increased. And so using that vertical stack as an extra defender, it's important. So if things get moved from there, say it just goes backwards and it stays on the same side, you could keep the force the same way, right? And that's really on the mark to decide which way you're going to be forcing. So here it's still forcing to the left-hand side and still there. But then we might switch to the sideline. It gets flipped all the way to the sideline, and then we're going to be forcing back the other way. And you'll notice that the mark on this one is you're not standing on the side, kind of forcing them back to the middle. You're almost flat because you're using the sideline there as a part of your defense. But if you were standing on the side and pushing back to the middle of the field, it basically gives them the entire field to throw to. So you're adjusting the angle of your mark as the disc moves around the field. It's a fun one to play with. It can be pretty frustrating right away because there's going to be a lot of miscommunications and things like that. But it's something to work on. And you know, if you can play it well and communicate as a team, it's a very effective in certain conditions.
A question: if you're the players covering the cutters, are you switching your side that you're standing each time?
Yeah, I'm noticing that in this diagram I've forgotten to switch the sides basically of those defenders. So like you would be actually moving kind of and orbiting your player to kind of say, okay, well, this is the most dangerous spot. You know, thinking about those quadrants again, going back to that, the quadrants are shifting here. What's 1, what's 2, what's 3, what's 4. So it's adding that shift where it's like, okay, we really don't want unders on the force side, but that force side's changing. So as a defender, I have to switch where I'm going. And, you know, the way to beat this as an offense is just to move the disc quickly because it creates confusion. But as a defense, if you're playing against a team that's very static, you know, they have a couple of handlers that really like to hold the disc for a long time, it can be very effective as a way to kind of contain that. Another idea is to have just a straight up mark. So instead of forcing one way or the other, you basically just play flat. And that flat mark really tries to take away the middle of the field. So you're forcing the disc to flare out towards the sidelines. So as defenders downfield, you can adjust for that and really know that your mark in the middle is going to be playing flat and moving to take away the middle of the field. And know that as a downfield defender, you can now kind of shade towards the sidelines on either sideline because that is the dangerous spot. Similarly to that, you can kind of do something which if a team is hucking a lot. So a straight up mark, I would say, you know, you're taking a couple steps off your mark, you're back a little bit, and you're not necessarily trying to stop every throw. You're trying to stop those throws up the middle again. Some teams, you know, have somebody who's a big thrower. They really just want to huck the disc and you know, it's been hurting you all game. They're making these connections deep. So saying to the person who's marking that individual, or if it's an entire team that's kind of hucking a lot, you know, we might say, okay, let's take a no huck or an anti-huck mark. And the difference here is instead of just straight up, you're actually going to be active on the mark, and you're going to be kind of moving. So you're taking away that deep space, and you're going to be moving back and forth as a mark, kind of to say, as they pivot and look for those long throws, we don't want those to get out. What you notice here about the downfield defenders is that because we've said we do not want long throws, as downfield defenders, we can say, okay, well, there's no long throw going out. We're playing team defense here. We're all committed to this idea. We're staying underneath. We're not going to chase our people deep because that deep throw, if it does come up, it's going to be contested. It's going to be floaty. I'll have time to get there. I am really committed to playing underneath, no unders defense. Conversely, in some situations, it might be valuable to actually force unders, to actually play everybody downfield to force them to come under. And this kind of can happen in situations where, you know, they have good cutters, but they're not great throwers. You know, you want the disc in their hands. And so in that situation, maybe you don't want them to get deep. You want to force them in towards. It can also kind of constrain the space they have to work in. Here, you can see if your defenders are all standing behind you, there's less space to work in as an entire team of 7 players. And so this can be effective in those kind of conditions. Another way you might use this is depending on where the sun is. If you know you have the sun coming into players' eyes, use that to your advantage and push players into where they have to run in. You know, they're looking into the sun as the throw is coming up. No one really wants to get hit in the face with a frisbee, so they're going to be hesitant and things like that on that position. So, you know, field orientation and environmental conditions are important for thinking about what kind of defense you might want to do. This is just introducing concepts that you could try. These are all ones that are kind of, you can get everyone on the same page. They require a little bit of communication, but going a step further is a lot more communication. And this would be kind of like a clam or switching. This is where you are guarding someone, but you might not be guarding them for the whole point. Instead, you're taking away, it's not quite a zone in the way that we'd introduce zones, but you're taking away space on the field and you're switching players. So you will follow your player a little bit, but if they go deep, especially say on the right-hand side of the screen here, you have a defender who can switch. You can just switch back and forth. You have really good communication. This can really eliminate a lot of cuts on the field where you end up chasing your offensive player. And so this one does take a lot of work and a lot of communication, but I've seen it work tremendously effectively. And it's really interesting to throw out maybe even as just a single point. You know, you've played man or person defense for a number of points just with kind of no unders, and then suddenly you throw in a switching kind of look, and people are like, oh, whoa, now there's somebody behind me and someone in, where do I go? You know? And this is a really good one to use gender to your advantage. You know, if you have women who are strong players, they don't need to cover a man necessarily, but they can get in the way and just kind of take space away perfectly well. And that allows them to kind of contribute to an overall team defense where it's not necessarily just requiring men to play, right? I think a pinnacle of Frisbee is really mixed Frisbee and using all our strengths on the field and thinking about that. And I've had the opportunity to play with some women players who are way better than I am. And so they taught me very quickly that they can handle their own on the field, and that it was awesome for me to be able to play on an entire team like that. You can, of course, do clam switching as well in a vertical situation where you might bracket. This is kind of what we would call it, where you have defenders on both sides. This is kind of from a static position, but you can see that we have defenders on the break side and defenders on the force side. The number of defenders in a given space depends on the team. You can have someone in the deep space as well. And in this situation, I've seen teams play this where it's kind of consistent. You know, they would kind of stay in their positions a little bit. Whereas other teams might say the first person who comes to you, you're now on that individual for the rest of the point. So it's just an initial setup to take away set plays. You don't really mark up with individuals. You mark up in a role, and then your individual is whoever cuts towards you. What about marking and sideline marks? This is another one where you can have a couple of different situations and different kind of things you could try as defenders. So in general, this is kind of what our sideline might look like, where we have the disc on the sideline, we have our stack in the middle, we have a bail. Say we're higher in the stall count and we know we're looking towards the bail. Most teams generally run a bail system that kind of consists of kind of trying to get 45 degrees up line. You're trying to get into that power position that's kind of there. As a defender, we're trying to take that away. As a mark, we're trying to take that away. And so really, we're both trying to take it away, and we're not working necessarily really well together. So what you could try instead is something where you really commit to a role. Each individual here, the defender on the bail and the defender on the thrower, would commit to a role. And so one of them that I know as like these terminology is called hardest. And that's where, as the mark, you're basically only taking away up line. You're not worried about throws to the backfield or necessarily out to the side. You might be trying to stop maybe some cheap inside throw. And as the bail defender, you're now only committed to taking away those flat throws across or behind. And this is a really kind of, you can do this as your normal defense on the sideline, but you can also throw it out at certain situations, and it can be really confusing for a team which are used to seeing a certain look and then having to look at this where it's like, oh, now where do we go? You know, how do we beat this on the fly without knowing what's going on? Similarly, in some situations, you might do the opposite, which is kind of called the easiest. which maybe is the mark then shifts and is forcing that throw up line, whereas the defender on the bail is now really kind of committed to not giving anything in line. But if they go backwards, that's the mark's responsibility. So you flip those responsibilities here. You might be asking yourself, when would you ever be doing this where you're forcing them to throw it upfield? But depending on wind conditions and depending on space, as you get closer to the end zone, there's less and less space. And so this can actually be effective the closer you are, because the huck that's shown here basically would become less and less viable, and you can actually take away that space in the front cone. The other one you can do is switching. So you might not switch as an entire defense, but maybe the handler defenders would be able to switch back and forth. So in this case, we might see where bail is cutting up line, and they might beat us on the inside shoulder. As Jen said, they get beat up line. It's like, oh no. So now what? Am I going to chase this bail upfield, or can this mark fall off, take away that really dangerous throw, and then as the former bail defender, now I go and mark. The one thing you have to know about this is it means you have to start your stall count over again. But in some situations, that actually might be worthwhile if you prevent this look and an offense is really running on this up line, up line, up line. They can't generate that, or if you take that away, maybe everything slows down and stops, right? So it can be something that you can talk about, and I've heard this called roll or switch. And this, again, is going to require communication between those two defenders. So that's a ton of different potential looks, and not even getting into zones or 50-50s where you're kind of combining zone and man or person defense. And so when do you employ these different defensive strategies? So as a coach, I like to do it early in the game to try out a couple different things just to see, what's effective right now, what's working. Obviously, you think about the opponent you're playing, you think about the environment, like the wind, the temperature, what's the score and things like that. Well, early in the game, hopefully it's 0-0, but you get a chance to try out a couple different things and see what might be working. So you can think about, you might employ something continuously or maybe bring it back later in the game at a key point. I really like to change defenses after timeouts because timeouts, the offense has kind of said, okay, we're going to talk about this. We're going to set up a plan. Usually that's on the basis of looking at what the defense is doing. So if you come out with something completely different after a timeout and just changing even the force or say implementing something a little bit different, like even a zone, right? Then that can kind of change how they respond to that. And it's kind of thinking about when to switch it up or when to keep what's working. So I think that as you get to higher levels, you kind of get into a situation where people get into a groove and you might throw a different defense just to kind of see if you can get them out of that offensive groove, right? They're working really well. They're attacking the break side so well. Okay, let's throw a defense just to see if we can throw them off their game a little bit and try to generate some momentum for us as a defense to get a turnover and maybe get a break. And a big thing here for team defense is really talking as a team about what your team defensive goals are. And that's key to be on the same page. So I said, don't clean out the hardware store. So these are all things don't try to implement all of these in one go, right? It's just going to result in frustration and you're not going to play probably any of them very well. But if you pick one or two that you want to try to kind of say, well, we can start working on this and implementing this over the course of a season, you might be able to kind of work on it and improve it so that you can have it, at the end of the season. You need to set team goals too. You need to think about what goals are realistic and addressing weaknesses as a team. So if your team always gets beat, to the force side cone in the end zone, it's like, well, we can't say, well, we want to stop all of those because I don't think that's realistic maybe, but maybe we want to say we want to prevent scores on that front cone for the first half, or we want to stay below 3 scores in that area for the game. By setting those kind of goals, you can get together as a team and commit to that. And even if you don't win the game, you kind of improve on that one part of your game. Being patient with many of these is important. So something like the force middle, you're going to be working, especially in a league game situation where you might not be practicing, you're going to be working these out really quickly in the middle of the game. So you have to be patient and not necessarily give up on things very quickly. And then the commitment is kind of trusting the process. So it takes a while to retrain. Even forcing backhand, if you're used to forcing flick, will be a big change for a lot of players. And thinking like, well, how do I stand? What am I taking away, right? There's little variances there that take a little bit of time. So you kind of have to just trust that. And so then overall, again, to reiterate, try a new approach at league or practice, and think through what you're doing on the field. So this is both individually and as a team, maybe. Focus on talking more with your teammates on the field. So you can do that individually, and then you can make that a team goal to really say, okay, we need to communicate more. We need to communicate about switches, or we need to communicate when breaks are coming up, or things like that, so that we can start creating that culture of communication in a team, as a team. And then on your own, especially now, maybe watching video. Going back, there's now more and more and more video of games being played, and just kind of watching a game and seeing what defensive strategies are used, kind of looking at different aspects of the defense you might want to work on, whether it's the mark or, oh, they're trying to force under, they're using a different defense. Let's look at it and see if we can break it down. Following a defense rather than following the disc. It's hard with some of the filming because the camera follows the disc, but sometimes you can get wide angled shots. And there's some YouTube links there that Jen had that I'm just reiterating. And so then that's it. And I'll say questions, and I'll kind of say thanks, and you can send any questions to me, and I'd be happy to start a chat. Frisbee Nerds Unite.
One thing, if you could maybe touch on, so a lot of our leagues, especially in the indoor, and then right now with the cohort league, are a hat league. So you're not necessarily playing with the same group of individuals. And then often you just kind of show up and everyone defaults a force forehand, vertical stack, person defense. Do you have any advice for folks playing in that kind of arrangement to kind of try to get a group of random individuals to follow one of these strategies?
I mean, I think that those situations, I guess, in a hat league or even over a tournament, you have multiple games kind of thing to do it together. And so I think it would just be kind of not being afraid to suggest looking at a different option. Yes, there's like usually everybody kind of says, okay, well, everyone knows force flick. We're just going to force flick. That's all. But being aware that there are other options and maybe suggesting it as an opportunity to say, okay, well, let's try this for a point, or let's try, this for half of this game, and just kind of putting it out there, because I agree that the tendency, if you're mixing with new players, or you kind of don't know each other, is just kind of go back to what the default is. And it does make sense on some level, but it also provides an opportunity for people to kind of try new things too. And if it's low stakes, and it's a hat tournament or hat league, no one really remembers who wins the hat league necessarily. Well, on the Facebook now with social media, everyone remembers, I guess, but you can improve your individual Frisbee skills and your team skills and your ability to try new things by doing that.
Is there a particular, of the different defensive strategies that you brought up, maybe a particular ones that would be a good place to start?
Yeah, I would say like not trying to do switching and things like that as like a new team and you're working on the focus, but just kind of thinking about, say, like, let's just force a different way. If the tendency is to say everyone, we're going to force flick, why not just try to say force backhand instead? Or I would say something like, let's try this one hardest mark on the sideline. One simple concept that you can kind of add in would be great. Force middle is not so bad. You do need to communicate about which way you're forcing, but you don't have to switch players per se. So those things that don't necessarily require switching, I think, are 1 degree easier and can probably be installed. And again, it's as a team, you have to have a talk and kind of say, okay, we're committed to taking away the deep throws. So as a straight up mark, then I can play underneath and I don't have to worry about the deep throw.
And I think it's also important to like try it a couple times, because I know often, you introduce a new concept and people are like, oh, it didn't work. Okay, let's not do that again. And it's like, well, we're still learning how to do it. So let's maybe give 2 more points or something. Yeah,
and that's kind of what I was saying. Like, instead of trying it for 1 point, try it for a half. Like, commit to it for a half. Again, that's maybe as a coach longer term thinking and thinking about like a season, which is maybe not reality for these hat teams, but Thinking longer term means you're making mistakes, but you're improving, right? If you don't make those mistakes, then you don't ever improve, and you end up playing and getting stuck in the same systems over and over again. And so, yeah.
Great. We've got a question from Cam. He would like you to maybe go into a little bit more depth about the triangle mark.
Can I just add one quick comment to what we were just talking about?
Sure.
And it's more so directed towards EUPA, I think, and that's to potentially think about ways to enable through the format of the offerings to be able to get into that strategy a little bit better, whether it might be like a mulligan idea where, okay, that point's not going to count because we were trying out something new, or an extra timeout strategy would be neat to.
Oh yeah, I like the extra timeout idea. It's like, okay, so you have one extra timeout, you know, or even a mulligan. It's like, hey, we're going to try something new on this point, you know. It's easy for people to get caught up in the stakes of those things, right? And that's why they don't try new things. So I think Al makes a good point.
Just to foster the environment of trying new things and learning more strategy.
Mm-hmm. And I know also we're kind of trying to implement having kind of team ambassadors and that kind of thing with the hat teams, to then you have like a person in a more leadership role to be able to say, hey, we're going to try this. Because I know a lot of the difficulties, like, you know, there's folks who are more shy, but they may have a really great idea, but are afraid to speak up and kind of try to get everyone to try something new. You know, and not all folks are as flexible in their play style always. So that's definitely a good point. Great, thanks, Al. So we want to head back to the triangle mark?
Yeah, sure. I'll click through. No, this is not. Well, whatever. Okay. Can I drag? Okay, I've gone. Sorry. So Cam wants to know more about the triangle mark. Again, the idea of a triangle mark is really just to be a little bit more dynamic and to think about what the throws are that you want to take away. If you think about break throws, in general, you could say, okay, no breaks, but there's different types of break throws. A break throw could be around the mark, which is like kind of backwards and around, or it could be an inside break, which is on the front side of the mark. They both can end up in the same place, but one is a little bit easier to throw than the other maybe, and one is a faster to reach spot than the other. And so the idea of a triangle mark is really to try to cut down on those angles so that you're not giving up that opportunity to have a very quick break happen. If you move back and forth and you're just following the player pivoting, as a defender, if you're on a flat line, on the same parallel kind of line as them, you will be behind them after, maybe not after the first pivot, but after the second pivot, or if they get you moving after the third pivot, you're going to be a little bit further behind every time. By taking a step back from the mark as part of that marking scheme, you know, when they take their second pivot back to where they were initially, and that's where, let me just see here if I click going forward.
So Greg, quick. So the idea is that if they lean into the break and you jump in with them, and then they go back to the side that you want them to throw towards, move backwards instead of just jumping back with them?
Correct. Yeah, exactly. Because as the animation here, the animation is set up now. So if I move this disc to the sideline, you can probably come across and stop that first break, because I mean, that's the focus mentally, right? You're like, okay, well, I don't want them to throw this backhand, so I'm going to get over there, and the backhand's a little bit slower. But if you think about coming back to the flick, that forehand throw is relatively quick to get off. And so if you're trying to come back flat across again, you're going to be behind. And so it gives that opportunity for that inside break is what I call it. Whereas if you step back a little bit there, you've cut that off and then you're now back in. that make a little bit more sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. You're basically not allowing them to break you on the inside then as the second move. They have to go back towards where you want to force them.
Exactly. Yeah. And that, because a lot of throwers will set that up, you know, I'm going to move you and then I'm going to come back to the inside, and I want that inside break because it's quicker to arrive.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. Thank you. That's the question I had. That makes perfect sense.
Great. Any other questions from the group? While folks are thinking up more questions, I just want to remind everyone there is a link in the chat to a survey. So we'd like to hear your comments about how you enjoyed today's presentation, and then any suggestions for future presentations, and then also to vote for our August presentation, and whether it be zone or more defense. So please click on that and fill that out. I guess as far as another kind of topic, I know a lot of folks in our group are either, have newer ultimate player friends who are just learning, or we interact with folks who are just starting out. Do you have any kind of suggestions to, what would you, if you only had 5 minutes with a newer player and they were asking you, okay, what do I need to know in order to play effective defense? What would you tell them?
Count stalls.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, like playing with newer players here in Camrose and trying to introduce them. It's like it seems to be, I guess because we're our own referees, right? We're our own officials, that we have to count the stalls. That's the first thing, but that's beyond skill level. I really think thinking about marks is really kind of an initial point, where you have 5 minutes with somebody, being a little bit more dynamic on the mark, and committing to moving a little bit, but not over extending yourself, I guess, is where I would start with thinking about a newer player. What can we do to kind of improve our defense? And I would also, at the same time, I think when I started, I really did I didn't really know how to throw a flick, so I could throw a frisbee backhand, and then everyone forces you flick, right? And so then your backhand starts to not work because everybody's forcing you flick. And so as a beginner player, being comfortable marking both ways in that first year or season, I think really can kind of set your mind up to be able to take on new concepts. And so not just kind of saying, oh, well, everyone's a weaker thrower, so we're going to force flick. So let's force backhand and start thinking about that.
Because then you end up generating a lot of really good forehand throwers who maybe have weaker backhands as the season progresses.
Yeah, so maybe it's the second half of the season, then you throw backhand and everyone else can't complete a pass. But I think that marking and that energy, thinking about that energy on the mark and not sitting flat-footed, especially to be dynamic, can be really helpful on a new league team.
Do you have sort of suggestions for, a lot of these concepts you've been showing, 7-on-7 game, which is a lot of tournament play. But the reality is there's a lot of 5-on-5 and 4-on-4 ultimate. So what sort of strategies do you think are more effective because you have the smaller field and you have less players on the field to cover?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's if you think about 4-on-4 or 5-on-5, it's a little bit of a different beast, but I think a lot of these actually scale down to that. I mentioned a little bit that if you're playing indoors, defense, I think, just generally becomes harder because there's more throws that are available. There's no wind affecting people's throws. And so it's really, I don't want to say difficult, but it's more difficult. And I would say things like, as a team, committing to pushing people to one side and really holding a force and working on your mark to hold that force can be something that translates really well to 4-on-4 or 5-on-5 defensively.
And I like how you mentioned, because hammers play a larger role because more people can throw the distance is shorter. So more people can kind of huck a field with a hammer on an indoor scenario. Keeping that, in account. And then also, of course, you've got walls and obstacles and things nearby that, versus the sun and the wind, you now have other things to consider as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that because more people can throw long, or like as an indoor, like someone who plays a little bit of indoor but not as much, I would focus on just kind of being able to stay, you know, under that quadrant one. Like, can I take away my unders? Can I really commit to taking it away? You know, to being within, you know, I can touch my player when they go deep, but I can reestablish my position so that they can't get the disc underneath. That would be really key, some of those key skills to work on.
Al's got another question here. So
this is a great question. I have the chat open now so I can see it.
Okay, I'll read it out loud so everyone watching after can hear. As a defender, where should I be looking? Are there specific times when I should be looking at the thrower, and when should I be looking at my check?
Yeah, this is a great question. Thanks for asking, Al. Because I didn't talk about it on the mark. Where do you look when you're marking? A lot of like people who start, they look at the disc, right, where the disc is moving, and it's very easy to kind of see the disc or see a fake happen, and it gets you out of your off balance, and so the thrower can get a throw out. I preferentially look at someone's kind of chest to kind of look centrally, or maybe someone's eyes, because if you look kind of between those, you can kind of see throwers when their eyes get big. That usually means that they do give signs about when they're going to throw, and so you can do that. I would say not looking at the disc is probably a really good thing. But then as a defender downfield, like where should you be looking? When are you looking at your mark or your check? And when are you kind of taking a look back at the disc? I usually like to try to teach players how to triangulate, so you can have some sense of, okay, I can see out of my peripheral vision where the disc is or where other players are, but my focus is on the person that I am covering. And when I mentioned the quadrants, that's where I would say there are specific times, you know, when your cutter has made a cut, I think your focus should be more on them than where the disc is. And when they're clearing or they're moving in a way that's not as dangerous, again, we can think about that quadrant idea to think about where the most danger is, then that gives you an opportunity to take those quick kind of shoulder checks to kind of see, okay, where is the disc still? Is it moving? Has it moved? Has the angle changed? And then getting right back into, okay, where is my check going? Where are they moving? So especially when they clear to, you know, the break side, I think that's an awesome opportunity to take a quick look. When they clear deep to that break side, that's an awesome opportunity to have an even longer look, because the likelihood of that throw coming up deep is really kind of less.
If you're, say, covering a deep thrower, like in the end zone, is there where should you be? Behind them, in front of them? What's, and especially if you're maybe in a situation where you're smaller and they're taller, and what's the most advantageous spot?
So like on a huck, basically you're saying like you're running with your player. Where do you kind of go to establish space, I guess? Mm-hmm. I think this is a skill that I've worked on with a couple of teams is being able to read a disc and where it's going to land, that you want to be in the inside position. You want to be as a defender where that disc is going to land before the offensive player can establish their position in that place. So I would say inside the disc, like inside of your player where they're coming, is always going to be advantageous. And kind of, again, that whole point about dictating what the offense can do. If the offense can time it, then they're going to be able to jump and kind of jump when they want to. And as a defender, I've seen so many discs kind of just be missed, or because the defender jumps a little bit early and it causes the offense to react to it, that they need to jump as well. And so being in that inside position allows you to kind of time your jump a little bit better maybe, and to force the offense to react to you.
There's another question from Cam. So for person defense, is it better to be next to your mark or strategically a number of steps away in their lane?
Yeah, Cam's on the mic. So can I ask, no, that's okay. For person defense, do you mean downfield?
In particular, like I know a lot of times on the first cut, someone will cheat in a fair much to cut off a bunch. Is there a strategy on that being on a second, third, or fourth as well, jumping more into the fourth side to be ahead of them, or are you better off being near your mark to eliminate them from the visual of the thrower?
Definitely. I think this is going to depend on the matchup you have. So as Al asked earlier, what happens when you're covering a faster player? In that case where you're covering a faster player and you know that you have to take a little bit more time to react, you would want to create a little bit more space. But I think your question here is more about just, okay, they're initially setting up a stack. Where do we stand as defenders? Do we stand right next to them? Do we stand off a little bit?
Correct.
I would say that you want to give a little bit more space. Like you want to give enough space that you can react to them. Are you talking about being way out in the lane, basically?
Well, I guess the difference is, like, should you be 1 foot away, 5 feet away, or consider being 10 feet away?
Yeah. I would say if I had to give a prescriptive thing, it would be kind of like 3 to 5 feet, basically. I think that, as I said, in that quadrant thing, you want to be 3 to 5 feet, but you want to think about where the easiest, most dangerous throw can come up, kind of thing, right? And easiest and dangerous are not necessarily the same thing, but in that quadrant, if we're trying to take away those unders, you can be off, 3 to 5 feet in front of them to really kind of say, okay, I have this ability here. If they cut deep, I can now make up that ground, right? You have to think about where you can space out that distance so that when they change direction, that you're not going to get, you're going to be able to change your direction at the same time and establish that space again. Oh yeah, there we go. Right now, yeah, exactly. So that's my answer. 6 feet, right? Yeah.
Social distancing.
But yeah, I think that it can come back, Cam, to being a team decision, right? Like if you know that you want to stop those unders and they're constantly getting them, maybe you say, okay, everyone play, 8 feet off. Let's just see if we can stop that first throw. The danger of that, especially from an initial stack, is that then you give them that opportunity to go to the break side. And if you have that much space, it's going to be harder to close that amount of space, even if a floaty throw comes up.
Yeah, and I guess if you're a really strong force marker, allows you to cheat over bid as well, leaving them open on the break side.
Exactly, and that's where the two kind of interact here, is that if you have a really strong mark, everyone trusts that they're not going to give up that break throw. You can be much more focused on taking away that force side.
And I think you mentioned this earlier about sort of like you're essentially managing risk, right? Like what can you give up and what can't you? So in the scenario where someone's faster than you and you're trying to cover them, you want to position yourself to the best advantage. But if it's inverse, and sometimes that happens where, you're much faster, you can afford to take a little bit more space, knowing that if you need to get there, you can get there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that speed mismatch eventually might hurt you a little bit, but initially you can kind of think, again, as a team, what are we comfortable giving up and what are we really trying to take away? And if you can commit to that, then as a team, even if they get those things that you've said, okay, those are okay, you can contain it and kind of continue to play defense and have more opportunities to generate more turnovers.
Great. Any other questions out there? And folks, feel free to unmute and speak up, since I don't think there'll be 20 voices. But if there isn't, I think we can probably wrap things up a little bit.
I'll just say one last thing about that.
Sure.
Last answer. And it's to some of what Greg was talking about earlier about trying new things, is for that question of how far away to stand, and lots of other questions like that on defense, where you're wondering about you want to know what's the exact number, and the answer is there really isn't one. You just have to try one thing, see if it works, or if it doesn't. And if it doesn't, you adjust and you keep making adjustments. And that's
I think that's a great point, Al, because for instance, even like I've had discussions with teammates. You're asking, like, so where are you looking? Are you looking at your check? Are you looking at the disc? Some people like to triangulate, with their hips outwards towards the away from the thrower. Some like it inwards. And so it's really going to come down to, can you do the job that your team has asked you to do. And by experimenting with different ways to do it, especially in practice or at league games, it gives you an opportunity to develop those skills to say, oh, well, that felt good. I felt that I could turn and take that away. I felt that was a great distance for me. Oh, I got beat. Maybe I'll take a step back and try that. Oh, that was too far. Now I'm going to kind of center it in, and making those mistakes and having that opportunity to do that is a good way to test it.
And I think that's definitely a challenge when trying to coach newer folks, right? Because on one hand, you don't want to give so much information that then they're overwhelmed. Well, it all depends on this scenario or this scenario. But then at the same time, the fear is if you make it sound too finite, then you're kind of creating a player that's already stuck in a box before they realize there's much more to ultimate than.
Correct. And I probably should have not given Cam a number. Don't quote me on that, Cam. No, but I think that's where you kind of say, well, try it. I'm not going to give you a bunch of different possible scenarios because I can't even list all of them. So try something different and see how it feels. And then we can talk about it afterwards, and that's where you kind of say, just give it a shot.
Oh, yeah. Cam made a comment about it. All numbers are for optimal non-COVID situations.
Okay.
Here it's right now, more space is probably better.
Yeah, I don't there's a couple people who are playing, right? How is defense? Is there a lot more room on the field, or is there less room on the field?
We actually changed some of our rules a little bit. So we increased our disc space to 1 meter instead of 1 disc width.
Okay.
Which was opened up some things defensively, but within a meter, you're still pretty effective. I find as a taller person, if somebody is within a regular disc space, I can throw around them no problem. At regular times, I'm basically never calling disc space because if you're up against me, chances are I'm still looking over your head. So I'm just going to throw around you. The other thing we did is we set any contact can be called as a foul, and that has just helped people to be way more aware of just everything that's going on the field at the time.
Yeah, and that's both of these rules are really interesting, where we usually play under a kind of a set framework. And both of these things would be things that, I might try in a practice with somebody. Okay, no one can mark within a meter, just to get people thinking about defensive strategies when it comes back. What, that was great. I felt like I can stop more throws when I was a meter away. So, wow, cool, try it, right? And even I like the contact thing. It's okay, well, how do I really avoid all contact, but still play Frisbee?
Yeah, and it's really just I think it's in even just playing one game, I felt my awareness of everything that was going on was way better than it was before.
Interesting. Silver linings then.
Yeah.
Yeah, the ultimate kind of getting people to think a little bit more consciously about what's happening.
Yeah.
And I think that's back to what you mentioned, Greg, about some people are more tactile learners and they kind of just learn by doing, whereas some folks just need to see it in a diagram to kind of really comprehend. And ultimately, we want to create players that are, thoughtful on the field and aware of what's happening. So that's great. And just for folks watching from elsewhere, so just to clarify, Brian's from Saskatoon, where the rules are a little bit different in Saskatchewan than they are here in Alberta. So we are able to, I think, play our 5-on-5 league kind of without any rule changes. But I think folks are still conscious about staying a little bit further away than they normally would and adapting their play style as such.
Yeah. And you know what? We were talking about opportunities to adapt play styles. Maybe this is an opportunity to adapt play styles, right? Right now kind of thing is try things out in your cohort that you might not otherwise try out.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other comments or questions? Doesn't look like it. So I think let's wrap up right on time.
Great.
So thanks a lot, Greg. This was super enlightening. I like to see diagrams. I'm a visual learner, so this is perfect. And I'm sure there's a lot of folks out there who are the same way. So thanks a lot.
Great. Thank you very much.